All right, we're going to get started mostly because there's a huge delay on the live stream from live to where we're actually what you see versus what I'm doing. So if you do ask questions, that's fine. Feel free to do that. It just may take me, I don't know, probably it was about 20-second, 30-second delay. It was a pretty long delay. And I don't see a quick and easy way to change that delay without messing with settings and restarting the stream, and I don't want to do that. So, yeah, that's the game plan. All right, let's go. So, um, writing an LEQ. So, when it comes to LEQs, let's type AP World FRQ. All right, so the LEQ we're going to have this week, I have no idea what's going to happen to BG days. Bottom line, if G is Thursday, we're doing it Thursday. If G is Friday, we're doing it Friday. I know there may be more snow coming this week. I don't know. The first from Thursday onward, the first G day we have that's a full period, you're getting the LEQ. At least that goes for my students. I assume Mr. Mann's students are on the same schedule. I believe we are. But there we go. Okay, so let's see. Let's look at this will work. All right, so let's look at a set of real LEQs to start, and we'll do that right here. Okay. So when it comes to LEQs, how many people do we have right now? We have 15. That's good. All right. So when it comes to LEQs, the most important thing to remember is you're on your own, and you typically get a choice. Now, for us, we've already decided, Mr. Mann and I, we're not doing choices. We're going to have 3 different LEQ prompts. They're all related to the material, but the material you're reading is everything from the prior to World War I era all the way up to the World War II era. So there's a lot of room in there for an LEQ. Typically, the LEQs are bounded by the range of years they cover. So in other words, if you look at this particular one here, we don't really need that part. We don't need this at all, actually, but whatever. All right, so if we look at this one here, this is a 2023 LEQ set. So you have 3 different LEQs, and each of them are a different topic altogether in a different time period, right? So it is a 1450 to a 1751. There's a 1750 to a 1951, and then there's a 20th century, which is 1900 onwards, and that's pretty typically the breakdown. We're not going to be bound to that, so whatever we think makes sense is what we think makes sense, so just be aware. Just to kind of go through the logistics of what we're doing, considering certain instances that happened, of which the resolutions will be made available to those involved when we get back from break, whenever the hell that is. Bottom line is we're looking at a sharp attempt to turn this LEQ around as quickly as we can. So we need 3 different LEQ prompts. Me and Mr. Mann are going to derive those. they are not going to be even like, oh, yours is like mine, but mine's differences and yours is similarities. Nope, they're going to be totally different. And they're going to be looking at different elements, different things, different parts of societies, whatever. So you're going to have to be ready for that. That's the part that you're responsible for. Our responsibility is make sure you're prepared to write them. Now, we've written one already. It's been a while, so let's take a look again. So you'll see how they lay out, right? So you have these three options. Again, you're not getting an option, but I'm just showing you how the system works. You'll have what I call a little background sentence, which is not really the prompt, because the prompt is a prompt. It prompts you to do something. And then it has the prompt, which is the material that follows there afterwards, right? So the thing you have to do. So I'm not too keen on worrying about this part, really. For my money, this part's not that important, except where it maybe defines your time period, maybe, but often it doesn't even do that. So for me, I just focus on the prompt. And in this case, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which ongoing cross-cultural interactions affected trade and or exploration from 1450 to 1750. So there are a couple different things that are going on here that you have to be aware of. For example, the and or means you are not required to do both. I wouldn't even recommend you attempt to do both. There's quite a bit of work to be done there if you try to do both. Likewise, there are two different things. There's trade, exploration. Now, one certainly can lead to the other, but they're also very, very different. In effect, now, as a teacher, in effect, what they're doing with that question is they're saying, okay, do you want to talk about Portuguese, or do you want to talk about Spaniards, or do you want to talk about something in between? In other words, in the very earliest days of that era, you have Portuguese doing their thing in the Eastern Hemisphere, and you have Spaniards in the Western Hemisphere. Later on in this era, though, you do get the East India companies, which are all in the Eastern Hemisphere. You could bring slave trade into this and talk about slave trade, which is very much ongoing during this era. So you could talk about that. Later on, the slave trade develops, right? So that's all possible. You could talk about things like mining or cash crops or whatever, but you have to talk about the extent to which ongoing cross-cultural interactions, meaning they tell you as a baseline, there are cross-cultural interactions. They are ongoing throughout the period. They're happening. To what extent do those affect trade and or exploration? Now, again, you could say a lot, not much, etc. Those are usually weak answers, right? You want to just go beyond extent. You want to give the nature of the extent. So, for instance, the demographic changes that occurred due to the depopulation of the New World resulted in the need to enslave Africans to replace the laborers that were indigenous to the New World. And as a result, new cultures such as, or new cultural shifts occurred in religion, in speech patterns, and in Western hemispheric traditions. I don't know. I made up three categories there. We'll get to that in a minute. But you have to do something like that. And you talk about trade or exploration or both, and it's kind of left to you. Now, this one down here, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which the Enlightenment ideas were the primary cause of one of the revolutions or independence movements other than American from the period 1750 to 1900. And you have a bunch. There's a lot in there. And you could find Enlightenment ideas because it could be revolutions or independence movements. And that even lets you do some things that maybe are kind of not exactly those things. For example, can you see German unification as an independence movement? Theoretically, yeah, because parts of Germany, as we know it at the time, were under the sway of other foreign powers like the Austrians. You could say the same thing about the Italians. Large chunks of Italy were under the sway of foreign powers. You could, of course, look at this beyond Europe, as I would always recommend you do in this course, because we study a lot more stuff beyond Europe. And you could look at things like the Sepoy Mutiny. You could look at things like attempts at revolutions. It doesn't say it has to be Atlantic world revolutions. It can be revolutions anywhere. So you could say Taiping Rebellion. Now, the Enlightenment ideas caused the Taiping Rebellion? Well, not directly, no, certainly not. But you can make a case that, because it's evaluate the extent to which, you could say the Enlightenment was not a particularly large factor in revolutions like the Taiping Rebellion. It doesn't say these revolutions have to be against Europeans or Western nations or anything like that. So make sure you do account for those things. All right, I did notice a question pop up here. Let me see if I could find out who asked it and what it was. Why are you not giving choices for our prompts? All right, simple answer. You're not getting choices because you'll cheat. Either I got to make up, if I have to give choices, it's a really simple answer. If I have to give choices, then what happens is either I have to hide choices or me and Mr. Man have to come up with, I don't know, let's come up with a number. Say I gave 2 choices to every class. That would be 6 equally valid, equally difficult, equally worthwhile grading essays. Because I have to do 2 for my class, 2 for my other class, and 2 for Mr. Man's class, and they cannot be the same things, otherwise y'all cheat. We've already determined everybody cheats. Now you might say, I didn't cheat. No, but until I have the cheaters stepping forward and saying, I was a cheater, I have to assume that if I know for a fact some people cheat, and I did, and I do, and they're going to hear from me, if I know for a fact some people are cheaters, then I have to assume that the ability to have a good faith testing environment is simply not possible. So I have to create a testing environment of bad faith, where I have to, instead of assuming good, I have to assume malice. I have to assume that when my class is sit to take a test, a proportion of them are actively attempting to cheat, and not only they're attempting to cheat, but they're openly bragging about cheating to their friends. Weird friends. But that's why there's no choices. Simple as that. And if you want to blame anybody, blame me. It was my decision. I told Mr. Man, I said that this is the only way to do it. And I'm not going to give any choices, and therefore he felt, well, if you're not going to give choices, then I can't give choices either. And I said, yeah, I think that'd probably be right. So that's the answer. That's why we're not getting choices for prompts, is because the class cannot be trusted with honesty. And so since the class cannot be trusted with honesty, I have to treat the class under a, which I don't like doing, treating the class as a dishonest entity. But until I have those who were dishonest come forward and talk to me about their dishonesty, which they had multiple opportunities to do last week, and it was not taken, then I'm going to have to just go ahead and assume that their intent is to stay dishonest, right? Because they don't want to own it. So if they don't want to own it, then they just want to stay dishonest. And their hope is, I don't know that they were a dishonest one. Silly thing to hope. Silly thing to hope. So there's your answer. And I know that might not be a very satisfactory answer. I realize that an overwhelming majority of students probably have not cheated and never did cheat once in this entire course and had no intent to. But again, until I have those who did come forward to be very clear about their cheating, I have to just assume everybody is on the hook and will cheat. And by the way, this is going to change a lot of things in the course going forward. I didn't want to make this about that today, but since it was brought up, even things like corrections and how we're doing them, those are changing in my classes. Mr. Mann's classes are not affected by this, but they're changing in my classes. And in my classes, they're going to become quite a bit more of a headache to do. And you can thank the people in the classroom who made that possible. Anyway, back to the essays. So, develop an argument. So, for example, again, with this one, you could say that something like the Enlightenment idea had a minimal effect. Or, again, I wouldn't use words that are just extent. I would do the nature of the extent. We'll get to that in a minute when I go over the rubric. And then a third example, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which a 20th century revolutionary movement was inspired by one of these ideologies. Now, one of the risks always with this course is that, and I'm not looking at the camera because I'm going between different monitors, so don't hold it against me if I'm not. No. Answered that question in chat. No, there's no test corrections for the previous test in my classes. Sorry. Again, see previous commentary. Talk to your friends who bragged about how easy it was for them to cheat. Talk to your friends. They're the ones who made that possible for you. So, right, back to this. So again, we have the situation here where you have been limited specifically to 20th century revolutionary movements. That means if you start talking about an essay that began, or an essay, you use your essay and you talk about a revolution that happened before 1900, you are not in the 20th century. Huge problem. Your whole essay is a zero at that point. So like you must maintain the limitations of the time frame. Now, when we make up the essay, the LEQ prompts for this particular essay, me and Mr. Mann are going to be quite clear about what date ranges we're dealing with. My expectation, though, we haven't done this. I mean, our expectation was we were in school today talking about this, right? So we haven't done it, so it's going to be kind of a last minute thing, or we got to do it over the phone. We'll figure that out. That's what adults do. But my expectation is it'll probably be something where we have a pretty clear, like, dividing line. You know, maybe prior to World War One, up to the end of World War One, to after World War One into World War Two. Like some dividing line in the prompts that not every topic that we've studied or that the student should have been reading about in this issue, in this area, would fit every essay. Okay? So I think there will be some sort of dividing line time-wise. So your essay that you get, the material you want to write about may not be valid for that essay, because it might be that it requires you to use other material. In other words, is it more chapter 33 focus or chapter 34 focus? I think those were the two chapter numbers. I forget. But whatever the two chapters were, there will be some dividing line there. So please pay attention to that. Okay, let's take a look at the rubric. And then we're going to talk about writing the essay. So when it comes to writing the AP World, in fact, we could do it right here. AP World, AP History rubric. Okay, it doesn't really matter. It's the same rubric. Here we go. Okay, so this is the rubric for the LEQ. This is true for both AP World and AP US. So this is the official rubric. It's a little bit different than the one I've given you, but the one I've given you is the same rubric. I just tried to reword it in a way that would make it so that way things are more understandable for a student. That was my goal there. Okay? So, anyway, thesis, context, 2 points for evidence, 2 points for analysis and reasoning. The analysis and reasoning is really, did you use the correct historical skill, and did you earn the fancy point? You know how I feel about the fancy point, so there you are. Now this thing at the bottom, you are to ignore. This is, I got this from whatever, some teacher rubric, and they just added this to the bottom. I don't really know why they did that. They just did. In fact, actually, hold the phone. I want to make sure that this rubric is up to date. They have changed the rubric in recent years, and I do not want to be caught in a situation where the rubrics are not accurate. And hold, please, while I do that. Okay. I'm going to pull up the actual course description, because I see it says 2017, and they have updated the rubrics since then, and I don't want you guys getting the bad information. So we're going to kill that off for a second here. We're going to pull up the actual whole course rubric here. You're going to have to suffer through this while I look for the actual full LEQ rubric. This is a sample. You could tell this is live, right? Unprepped. Just, well, here we go. All right, here we are. This is the actual rubric, up to date. And it might be the exact same thing, but I don't want to take a risk. Something that was published in 2017. I'm looking to see if they say when this was first written. It doesn't. Okay, so we're just going to go use this. Okay, so here's the full rubric. So once again, the point breakdown is the same. It's still 6 points. I just want to make sure the requirements for each point are identical. So this is the rubric. This is the real one. This is the current one. Okay, thesis, still a thesis. Context, still a context. Your evidence is still 2 points. It tells us here what amount of information we need to have. We'll get to that in a minute. Then your 1 or 2 points, right? So the first point is, did you use the historical skill? And the second point is this fancy? Did you do something here that is super complex? Again, you know how I feel about that. All right, so let's go back up to the thesis. The thesis remains the thesis remains the thesis. There is no difference in how a thesis earns a point between the DBQ and the LEQ, as long as you deliver what they want. What do they want? They want a clearly defined response to the prompt that meets all the expectations of the prompt. Date ranges, things like that, on target, on topic, talking about the right things. If they ask about revolutions, you can't ignore that. You have to do what they tell you to do, etc. So all those kinds of things. Next, you have to make sure that in the thesis, now a two-sentence thesis is fine, but whether it's 2 sentences or 1, you must give a clear category or set of categories that you're going to examine. My rule is always the rule of 3. have 3 categories you're going to examine. So if I go back to one of these things here, I'll do this one, this here. In the 20th century, revolutionary movements were inspired by a variety of ideologies, including communism, nationalism, and or religious ideas. Develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which a 20th century revolutionary movement was inspired by one of these ideologies. Fine. I'll go ahead and do something simple. I'll do, what for me is simple, I'll do the communist revolution in China. So I'll say a 20th century revolutionary movement that was clearly inspired by communism or the communist theory of Karl Marx was the Chinese Communist Revolution, which occurred in the 1940s. That's not enough for a thesis. I now need, how am I going to investigate the extent to which communism inspired this? And I could say, led by the communist leader Mao Zedong, this revolution embodied many of the major beliefs of communism, including hatred of the property-owning class, reliance on the poorest members of society for support, and I guess nothing in this question stops me from going beyond their initial revolution. So I could say something like, and their desire to base public policy around Marxist theory. That's a thesis. That's adequate. It's not sophisticated. I didn't go too crazy. I name dropped Mao, but that probably wasn't necessary. We could certainly bring him up later on. That would be an example of that. So when you write something like that, right, I'm going to move my LEQ over here so I can still see it. Here's what it would look like if I were to, for example, do... Let's do this one. So this is another of these. Oh, can I not copy that? Can I cut and paste the picture into here? Hang on. Hang on, we got to steal something. Boom. Let's go here. Can I... allow? Did that one work? That didn't work. Alright, we're going to do this the hard way. So, development argument that evaluates the extent to which Enlightenment ideas were the primary cause of one of the revolutions or independence movements in this period. Fine. I can't talk about the American Revolution. No problem. So, I'll say, alright. Enlightenment ideas were, again, I don't want to say a large factor. I want to define the nature of the extent. So, to what extent was it the primary cause of a revolution? Let's say it was the primary cause of South American revolutions. So let's just say that Latin American revolutions, because that's one of the ones mentioned there. It's something that we had you read, so I'll just bring it up here. Enlightenment ideas were a integral, you wouldn't use that word, I suppose, were a, how about this? We'll do it this way. The ideas of the Enlightenment were a essential part of the underlying causes of the Latin American revolutions that swept the that swept the former colonies of Spain and Portugal. That would not be sufficient. I need categories of investigation. My categories would come here. I want to say boosted, but you can use whatever word you like. Boosted by the desire for self-determination and the underlying beliefs in the theories of Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke and Voltaire. The revolutions of Latin America So a previously colonized people sees their own independence while inspired by I don't want to say enlightenment again. No, sees their own independence. Period. Done. That's it. There you go. That's good enough. That's a thesis. So that's got everything there you would need. Now, that's good enough for a thesis. Context is the next point, right? So context. Context comes second in the rubric, but you really want to start with context. It really should be the background of the situation. So I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to move this down a little bit. Context should really be a part of the intro paragraph. And again, it should be the first thing in the intro paragraph. Excuse me one moment, please. I'll get back to you in a second. Streaming. Okay, so if we come to this idea of context. So context really does rely upon the question, right? So the question, once again, let me pull it back up here. In the period 1750 to 1900, revolutions, independence movements such as the American, French, and Haitian and Latin American independence movements occurred, and it's about the Enlightenment ideas, right? So your context could be a couple different things. It could be about the Enlightenment. It could be about these territories. It could be about whatever. I'm going to do a little bit of both. I'm going to say something like, in the era of 1750 to 1900, the philosophies of the European Enlightenment became part of the standard education for elites all over the world, particularly in areas where, not all over the world, that's an exaggeration, for elites in many, because it's not like if I go to China or Japan 1750, they're teaching us stuff. They're definitely not. In many parts of the world. There we go. Particularly in areas, and as the part let's get accurate, particularly in areas where Europeans had colonized and established European-style centers of learning, or in some cases, that's too big of a sentence. In many cases, colonized elites were often encouraged to send their own children to European schools in order to be, that too went crazy, in order to be educated. Wow, okay, something's going on here. I must be getting some lag spikes. Educated in the very ideas of the Enlightenment. Something like that. Then carry on with my thesis, and that's my introductory paragraph. So the key elements of a context, right? The LEQ context is always tricky. It's got to be background, number one. Number two, it's got to be relatively immediate background. Number three, it's got to be about the topics in the prompt, not just the background bit. So you can't just talk about you can't just talk about this stuff up here. You got to mention, like the Enlightenment's not mentioned here. You got to mention the Enlightenment. You got to mention causes. You got to mention something about this. It's got to carry that element in there. So I bring up the Enlightenment. I bring up what was going on beforehand. I bring up what these colonies were dealing with. I bring up how these people were exposed to Enlightenment ideas in the first place, which is really background, right? And then we go from there. So this is all, I mean, yeah, I know that this might feel like easy for you to do. Yeah, I know. But it is what needs to be done. Now, again, what standard do I think? Do I think this is sophisticated? I definitely do not. Do I think it's like barely adequate? No, it's probably like on the upper end of adequate for something I just popped out of the top of my head. Is it within the realm of everybody here do something like this, even to a slightly lower standard? Absolutely. So the key elements, again, for the first paragraph, right? You start with context, which is background, and must include references to the elements of the prompt. And then you need thesis, which must have a direct response to the core issues of the prompt. And remember, if it's similarity, talk about similarity. If it's change, talk about change. If it's talk about cause, talk about cause. Like, make sure that's in there. And 3 categories of investigation, which for me up here was underlying beliefs in the theories of Enlightenment thinkers, Locke and Voltaire. It's kind of 2 right there. In theory, desire for self-determination is another one. I could talk about how that's, so that's really 3 right there. I could have added 10 more if I really wanted to. I just wrote it up in this way. So that right there is sort of the first bit. Now, when it comes to evidence, and I think I did see a question get asked in the chat, so hang on. What do I consider the same thing as other essays, at least where you're building it? All right, Murray. So Murray asked, might be a dumb question. It's not a dumb question. What is the difference in the LEQ and the essays we have done previously? So you've done an LEQ previously, so keep that in mind. It was the first essay we did. What do I have to do differently, because it seems like the same thing as the other essays? So it is very much the same thing. So far, it is the same thing. What are the differences between DBQ and LEQ? LEQ context is something you have to invent. DBQ context is often a little bit easier because you can kind of base it around the background of the documents they give you, right? So there's a little more information there, so you can base it on the background of that stuff. Thesis, in the case of the LEQ, you have to invent these 3 categories. They have to come out of your head. In the DBQ, the 3 categories are actually 3 groups of documents, right? You take document groupings, and I say 3. You only need 2. The third would be nice. So if you don't get to the third one, or you don't get to a paragraph of the 3rd category, that's okay. 2 is the mandatory minimum. So in the case of the DBQ, it was to have at least 2 groups of documents, right? And those are your paragraphs. Well, the categories are the same thing here. The difference is you're inventing it. That's really the difference. So it should feel similar. I mean, for Christ's sake, I hope it feels similar for thesis and context, because they're in both essays. Now, the evidence is where it's going to get kind of different. So let's take a look. So to get the evidence, I'm just going to check and see if there are no other questions, because I certainly might have missed one. No. All right, so all the questions I got so far. All right, so evidence, right? So there are 2 qualities of evidence. There are 2 points available. You have to get the first to get the second. See, it's or, it's not and. 1 point provides specific examples of at least 2 pieces of evidence relevant to the topic of the prompt. Okay? So you have to give 2 pieces of evidence that are specific and relevant. We'll get to that in a minute. And support your argument in response to the prompt using the 2 pieces of evidence. So it's really 2 things. Give me 2 pieces of evidence and then use it to support your argument. If this feels similar to DBQ, it's because it is. So what happens in the body? So in the body, you're going to take a category of investigation. For my part, I'm going to go in. I don't think I can highlight in this stupid thing. I'm going to take the desire for self-determination as my first category of investigation. And I'm going to start with that. Now, you're actually doing this a little bit backwards, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the link that links this body paragraph to my thesis. That's the first thing I'm going to do. And I'm going to do that by taking a piece of those categories, taking one of those categories and making it the topic sentence of my body paragraph. By doing that, I automatically create the support to my argument, because a piece of my argument is now the focus of this body paragraph, right? So that makes it a part of what I'm doing. It makes it a piece of what I'm doing. It's like if I'm doing a biography about somebody, seeing like, okay, early childhood, teenage life, adult life, whatever. If I talk about their childhood in one paragraph, I'm linking it back to the overall biography of that person, and that's what we're trying to accomplish here. All right, I did see a question pop up, but I'm not seeing a question. I got a notification for one. That could have been the one that 1 minute ago. Okay. I don't know. I don't see it. I'll refresh just in case. Maybe it didn't go through yet. I don't know why it wouldn't have. Yeah, I don't know. All right, well, whoever wrote that, if you want to rewrite it, go ahead. Okay, so let's go back to this. So let's create that support. So again, I'm going to do the self-determination thing. So I'm going to say Latin American elites had a strong desire for self-determination and the wish to, I mean, I don't want to say what self-determination is, but all right, let me do this. Maybe I should make it a little bit simpler. Maybe I should make this something that, can I move my fat head out of the way? I really don't want to. All right, I'm just going to type around my fat head. All right, I don't want to say self-determination twice. So I could just say, has strong desire for self-determination. I could just do this. I could just do that. That's a topic sentence. I could just do that and just leave it. In fact, I will leave it there. That is as simple as I can make it. It takes the category from the prompt, from my thesis, and brings it into the topic sentence. This is now my topic sentence. Now, I can then begin to talk about, I need 2 pieces of evidence. So what kind of evidence do I think I could put in here, right? So what kind of evidence do I think fits this idea of self-determination? Well, I could talk about the racial issues of the castas system, which made it so that way even white people who were not born in Spain had lesser rights than white people born in Spain. There was a big difference between the Creoles and the Peninsulares. And pointing out that difference would certainly be a good example of a way in which the one class is, or a way in which people start to feel resentful and desire to have some say over their own lives, since they don't view themselves as anything lesser than the peoples of Spain. We could talk about the long years of colonization and how what's the word I want to use? Cultural shift in Latin America had been so large. And by that I mean a huge culture shift towards the attitudes of Western Europe already, right? Like, this isn't a place like India where Europeans came in, they're kind of here. This is a place that kind of became a settler colony. Not entirely, but there were a class of white elites that settled here. Remember, the early conquistadors were just that. They were settlers. Now, they weren't a massive amount of them, but they came, they conquered, and over time, this has been a long colony. They've been having them for a long, 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 long time. I mean, these Latin American revolutions, I mean, I don't know. Let's just take one for example. If we take, I don't know. Let's just take Bolivar. So Bolivar is another good example here. So Bolivar, bringing up Bolivar just as an example of an individual here, right? So he's president of Colombia, 1819 to 1830. So you could see here, you know, if you want to call it 1800, give or take, you could easily say 1800, give or take, is around the time period when these revolutions really kind of kick off. And if you look at Bolivar over here, I mean, he's a white dude, you know. Now he's descended from there he is. I mean, this is a white kid, right? And he's marrying white people, and his wedding has some mostly white people, but not all. And the reason for that is because this is the nature of the society he lives in. Sorry, I had it on the wrong screen. You didn't see that picture. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so back to this. So the idea being that you get a guy like Bolivar, and I could even talk about how, you know, Bolivar fits in here as somebody to mention and bring up because he is the leader of these independence movements. Really, it's his sort of thing. Can you write a good essay without mentioning Bolivar about this? Yeah, you could, but I mean, it really would be harder. So I could say something like, Latin American elites had a strong desire for self-determination. Since the earliest days of Spanish conquests in the New World, a racial hierarchy had been set up known as the castas system. Now, the reason it's good to say I just defined that. I defined the castas system. I could have said, since the earliest days of the Spanish conquest of the New World, there was the castas system. But defining it is better. Now, I know what it is, but your job is to make sure the grader knows you know what it is. So this is good for evidence. And you can't play a game like, well, how much is a piece of evidence? Don't do that. A fully fledged idea is a piece of evidence. Like, it's kind of subjective on behalf of the grader, so you want to give them more rather than less. So, since the earliest days of Spanish conquest in the world, a racial hierarchy was known as the caste system. Under this system, those who were racially white but were born in the New World were known as Creoles, and had lesser rights than whites born in Europe, who were known as peninsulares, those from the peninsula. Now you might say, well, how the hell am I supposed to remember all that? I will remind you the course is called History, and your job was to read the things I asked you to read. And so, you know, when people say to me things like, hey, why do we need to do these things? Why do we need to do this reading? Well, this is exactly the reason why. There's an entire essay on this thing where you're fully responsible for all of its information. And there is no help from any other, you know, sort of place. There's no DBQ. There's nothing like that. You can't go back and reread questions to try to give you ideas. Like, you are truly on your own. I'm just doing a quick check, see if any other questions that come up. My camera is not focusing well. Hold on while I fix my camera focus. Configure video. Camera control. Ew, autofocus is on. No wonder. Hang on. There we go. Better. Okay. Alright, back to this. Okay, so peninsulares. So that right there would be like a, for me, everything I wrote from since down to here. This feels like not even really a full piece of evidence yet. I haven't made my point. Like, what's my point about the evidence? So this, all right, no, that's not true. This for me is a piece of evidence. Have I used it to support my argument? No. I have to say how this supports the desire for self-determination. So what I might say is this created a sense of unfairness where those who were just as wealthy and just as racially pure felt like they were being discriminated against by their own country, despite being no different in any meaningful way. Now, you might think it's a little weird to argue on behalf of, say, racism. Hey, I'm white, you're white. You can't be whiter than me because you popped out of your mom there and I popped out of my mom here. It might feel like a weird argument, but in the rules of the caste system, that was the rules. And you could see why if a white person feels like they're being discriminated against generationally, year after year after year, generation after generation. And this is not for a little bit of time. This is for hundreds of years, right? It's for several hundred years. Why they might start to build a sense of resentment. Why do I have to listen to these people in this far-off land when I am white, just the same educated, just as wealthy, etc., and I live here, and I'm an elite of this area? Why should I have to listen to them? You could see how that would build resentment. This helped to lead to a desire for self-determination and eventually revolution. That's a full paragraph. That's a full body paragraph. You would now take another piece of the prompt. For example, let me scroll down a bit here. You would now take another piece of the prompt. Let's say John Locke and Voltaire. I can just use John Locke as an instance, and I could say another factor that, you know, to be fair, did I really reference the Enlightenment in this paragraph? Not really. I need to tie this to the Enlightenment. I have to say the extent to which this is part of the Enlightenment. So what I might do is right here. This created a sense of unfairness, but right here I might bring in the Enlightenment. So I might say, okay, this sort of, I want to say the word arbitrary. It's the right word to use. But this sort of unfair system was exactly the sort of power structure, I don't like that word, I would have said arbitrary. This type of arbitrary system was exactly the sort of power structure that the Enlightenment taught was not reasonable, logical, or sensible for a society to function with a social contract. Just one sentence that helps link it back to the Enlightenment, because really me not mentioning the Enlightenment is actually kind of a big miss, and I don't want to do that. A grader would go, yeah man, but what about the Enlightenment? The essay is about the Enlightenment. And so to be fair, although I'm thinking about the Enlightenment in my head when I think about self-determination, because I know the ideas of self-determination, the idea that you choose your people's future, that's kind of rooted in John Locke, right? So I know that, but I need to mention it. So I mentioned it to make sure it fits in. Now I can talk about John Locke as a second category. Another factor that contributed or that demonstrates the effect of the Enlightenment on Latin American revolutions are the teachings. Yeah, are the teachings of John Locke. Now I'm not gonna do it again, but now John Locke taught this, John Locke said that, and then how did that affect Latin American revolutions? Like, how did that affect these people specifically? Good place to bring up Bolivar, right? You might say that Bolivar referenced things like the independence of every person to determine their own future, or they referenced things like liberty as a key, like if I bring that Bolivar article back up, let me find it here, right? So here's Bolivar, yeah. Education, right? Hang on. I don't want that. I want his. Okay, so. I mean, this is very detailed, but basically, if you read this, you'll see things like, okay, he was in favor of independence. He was part of the Declaration of Venezuelan independence. He comes back, he fights. Here's some, you can read some of his quotes. I mean, like I said, I'm not gonna get too deeply into it today, but basically, he was fully exposed to the ideas of the Enlightenment. You can even say things like the American Revolution, which was definitely Enlightenment based, was a huge part of the inspiration for a lot of Atlantic world revolutions, including the Latin American Revolution, talking about like how life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is in Declaration of Independence for America, and how that successful revolution leads to other successful revolutions, etc., etc. The idea that they're drafting constitutions, the idea that they are talking about their own freedoms, the idea that they're rejecting this divine right monarchy thing, which was a clear attack point of the Enlightenment. They didn't believe in this divine right nonsense. So just that kind of stuff. At least most of them didn't. So you would bring it all up. I'm not going to write it here. But that would be how you'd score these evidence points. So you're basically creating that element for yourself inside of your own writing. Now, the last 2 points, again, fancy point now I feel. This point, though, everyone should be able to get this point. This point is one of the easier points in the LEQ. To do it, you have to use the historical reasoning skill as a structure to your argument. All that means is if it's a cause essay, you keep talking and referencing causes. If it's an effects essay, you keep talking and referencing effects. If it's similarities, keep talking about similarities. If it's differences, keep talking about differences. All your work is about those things, the causes, the similarities, whatever it is. Now, how do you know which you need? Well, that very much depends on the prompt, right? So now let me take you back to this page. Okay. Develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which ongoing cross-cultural interactions affected trade. This is an effect essay, right? Now, you can say cause or effect really with this, but it's effect. To what extent did this affect trade? All right. You could even treat it like a change essay. To what effect did it change the way people traded? But you have to bring up those terms. Again, the terms are not negotiable. They're in the rubric, right? So they are, again, comparison, which is similarities and differences, causation, cause and effect. These are on our board. They've been on our board all year long. You've been staring at them all year long. Continuity and change, and continuity over time. So it's change or continuity over time. And that's it. Those are your three. So it's three big categories with two parts in each. So comparison, similarities or differences. Notice I said or. Causation, cause or effect. And then change or continuity over time. Like, those are it. So if we go back to this again, we can look at these. Sorry, wrong thing. This. Okay. So, number 3, develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which enlightenment ideas are the primary cause, clearly a cause essay, of one of the revolutions, right? That's what we just did. So have I been talking about to what extent did this cause this? So by talking about the way the Enlightenment was a cause, that's me getting that point. That's how you do that. There's no other way. And then down here, was inspired by these ideologies. Well, inspiration, inspired by, is a cause essay. So if I talk about inspired by or caused by or something like that, influenced by, that would be good enough. So those are, you don't have to say the word cause, but you have to keep it on theme. So as long as you're doing that, which if you're not doing that, your essay is kind of like dead on arrival. But if you are doing that, you can easily score that point. So I like to make a big deal about which points are the easiest to earn in any one of these given essays. So let's go back to the rubric. As always, in terms of priority, thesis and context are priority 1. They're priority 1. You have to do them. They're in every essay. They're in both the DBQ and the LEQ. You have to do them. So I'm reasonably confident most kids will be able to do a thesis okay at this point. I'm not confident about context. You have to get used to doing the context. And one of the reasons I am not previewing any of the prompts to anybody is I feel like giving people any prompts ahead of time has always caused them to try to rehearse a context ahead of time, and I get delivered a terrible context almost always that really doesn't answer the prompt. So I'm hoping having to think of a context on the spot might actually improve rather than reduce outcomes here. We'll find out. We'll be able to compare it to the last set of LEQs. So those two are definitely number 1. The first evidence point is you can't really, you could get it without doing the reasoning, but man, that's tough. Like, if it's a cause essay and you're not talking about any causes, what are you talking about? Now, I've seen kids do it. I've seen kids just go on like a narration of history. Well, that's not good enough. I mean, for example, I'll put myself out there as a guilty party. I don't know that I was really talking very much about the way the Enlightenment caused something until I brought this in. Like, I needed that sentence, really. Now, did I need it? If another grader read this, would they give me the points regardless? I can't say for sure, but I can say for sure with this they would. Because I directly reference the Enlightenment. I directly say that, yes, this is the kind of thing that the Enlightenment talked about. Hence, it is a cause. It helped lead to this. It was part of this. It was something that spoke to this issue. That's why it's part of the causes. So, you have to have that. All right, now, as we all know, I do not want anybody chasing after this fancy point. I've either convinced you or I have not convinced you. It's up to you at this point. It's whatever. I'm still only grading this essay out of 6 points. We're not going to grade it out of full set. Oh, sorry, out of 5 points. I'm not going to grade it out of the full 6 because, again, you know how I feel about that. I think it's a losing proposition to try to go chase that last point, and I don't want anybody trying to do it. However, in this essay, unlike the DBQ, where I say, you know what, don't go for the fancy point, and also, I don't think sourcing is really worth it. On the LEQ, I suggest you go for every point, except for that final point. So all 5 points, I think you should go for. All right, another question came in. Let me see if I can find it. It keeps saying I have questions coming in. I don't know if it's true. Let's see. None there. All right, how do you recommend studying for context points if we don't have an idea of what part of the unit is going to be on, because this isn't this unit like very broad? Well, the whole course is very broad in that respect, right? How do you study for context? You know your history. There's no other way. So if I ask you about the causes of World War I, you better know the causes of World War I. So if the issue is like, to what extent did nationalism cause World War I? If that's the essay, you got to give a background. what was going on, why was there a World War One, or what? Not why was there, but what was the setup that would allow for nationalism to even cause that kind of situation? Like, again, it's like a trailer to a movie, right? That's really what it kind of is. It's like, what do I see if I'm watching a trailer for a movie? All right, so what movie did I watch? My kids made me go watch this movie Goat over the break. It was about a bunch of animals in a world where they play basketball. Now, the thesis is about, like, okay, what is the movie Goat teaching young viewers? That's like the prompt, let's say. And the thesis is like, try your best, show forgiveness, don't be cocky, whatever. There was a lot of these elements to it. Just because you're, don't let people tell you can't do things that you might be able to do, and don't lose hope, and there's a lot of that. But what was the context? Well, if you watch the trailer for the movie, you could probably determine the context pretty quickly. The world is clearly like some weird dystopian future where humans are dead and the animals have human properties. And you could tell that the world was like built, like these are like ruins, right? Like the places where they play basketball are like representative of geographic regions, but really intense geography. So it's almost like a climate change, like sort of warning. Like the goat plays in a place that's like overgrown with jungles. Like the stadium is like an overgrown mess of jungles. There's vines all over the court. They're playing around it. The horse guy, who's like the bad guy, he's like Horse LeBron. He plays on like a lava arena, and like everything there is like magma and lava, and like the whole place is like that. And the whole, it's not like it's a theme for just the arenas. Like the cities where these people are where these animal teams are playing, they're all like this. And there's a sharp racial hierarchy in the, I mean, it's kind of weird for a kids movie. There's a racial hierarchy. Now the racial hierarchy is the bigs and the smalls. That's what they call them. So the bigs are like the big animals, like the jungle cats, the giraffes, the rhinos, the bears, the horses, the bigger, strong animals. And then the smalls are like, the goat is a small, all his buddies are like gophers and mice and the cockroaches. At one point he says that he's sick of living with cockroaches, and then like a media agent says, hey, but aren't you like anti-cockroach? Aren't you being racist by saying that? The cockroaches want an apology. So it's like, it's tongue-in-cheek. It's making fun of that. But it clearly is like there is a racial hierarchy in this society. Like the kids aren't necessarily going to pick up on that. It's more like, hey, it's about, being, a small guy doesn't make you mean like you're a loser automatically, and you can do things that big people can do or whatever. But it's not kids and adults. It's very much, you are the, it's the aristocrats and the poors. Like that's what it is. And it's very much a, this little goat makes the smalls more socially acceptable by their success. So that's what the context I would do. So the context might be something like, the movie Goat, set within a dystopian future where animals have broken into a racial hierarchy between the big animals and the small animals, or maybe it's not racial, I don't know. A panther is not a goat anyway. Maybe it's more like a caste hierarchy between the bigs and the smalls. And that's how I'd set up the context. Like, what is the world in which this thing is taking place in? Why is there a need to teach the lesson that the small animals are somehow just as valuable to society and can be just as valuable for a sports franchise as the big animals are? Because the goat's the first small to ever enter the animal NBA. I forget what the hell they call the league. Yeah, I paid attention to this movie, as you could tell. I sat through the whole damn thing. It was pretty good, actually, for a kid's movie. But that would be how I would go about context. Like, okay, I am now explaining. You could picture the world. If you haven't seen the movie, you can now picture the world, because I explained the background. And you can see why it's not... It's a weird kind of movie in that respect, because it has this weird sort of dystopian future where there's a caste breakdown between big animals and small animals, and the small animals are putting their hopes in this goat who has talent but is physically inferior to those around them. Now, he's not able to beat the other guys in basketball. He just isn't. He actually loses a one-on-one with a big animal. But as a useful member of the team, that's where his successes lie. Sorry, I have to just take a look at this. Okay. All right, so that's pretty much, that's how I would do it. And I'd write about that. I'd introduce the paragraph with a couple of sentences about that. Again, I'd go with the dystopian future with the caste hierarchy between big and small animals being the setup of the of the whole movie. And I think that really does paint it. And I think if you have not seen this movie or you haven't seen the trailer and you don't know what I'm talking about, well, go watch the trailer now and ask yourself, to what extent did I make you understand the setting, scenario, and background elements that make the tension in the movie matter? Because that's what context is. Context is, why does this matter? Like, why would nationalism be a thing that matters for World War I? Why would militarism be a thing that matters? Why would competition over African colonies lead to World War I? Well, what the hell happened with those African colonies? Talking about Scramble for Africa, Berlin Conference, the need to maintain peace after Napoleon. There's all context to that stuff. Again, how do you prepare for it? Knowing your material. And knowing what your material connects to. And I've been trying to teach that all year long. That's been my goal number one. You have material, here's how the material connects. That's been what I've been trying to do. So my hope is that it'll translate in that moment. Again, I don't think context is really something you study for. I don't think you can study for context. Like people say you can't study for the SATs. I kind of agree with that. Because the SATs are testing those connecting points. It's not testing math. It's testing, do you know how to use math? And that's kind of what context is. It's not testing history. It's testing, do you know how to use history? I've said this from day one. Context is the most important skill a historian ever needs, and frankly, I think every human being, if they don't account for context, isn't thinking, actually. And I think the fact that context points appear on both of the essays, alongside argument points, thesis points, prove, that's my evidence for my thesis, that context is the most important skill in history. All right? So on that note, unless there's another question lying around, I'm going to call it. Let me see. I'm going to do a once over of all three sections. Nothing, nothing, and nothing. All right, so no new questions. So at that point, I'm going to call it. This video should self-post to my channel later on tonight. I've already set up all the necessary permissions. I had to make sure I told them I didn't AI any children into it. Otherwise, they wouldn't let me have it. So it might take an hour or two, but it will show up. So if you missed it or you want to share it with somebody else, feel free. We got, looks like our highest live concurrence were what, 19? Pretty good. I'll take 19 on a snow day. That's fine. We're not in tomorrow. Will I be around tomorrow to do another live stream? I don't know. It's going to depend. I'll see what happens. Me and Mr. Matt to touch base at some point here, and we got to figure out these essay prompts. I don't know what's going to happen with the BG schedule. I don't know if these days are state emergency days. We don't have to make them up. We do have to make them up. I really have no idea. So again, be prepared for a Thursday essay. Be prepared for a Friday essay. Be prepared for a Monday essay if those two don't work out. Okay? I imagine we're going to have full school days, Thursday and Monday guaranteed. Although again, they're saying snow Wednesday night. Who the hell knows? We'll figure it out. But be prepared as best you can. If anything, it's more time to prepare. All right? So we'll call it that. Thanks a lot, and I'll catch y'all next time.